So in constitutional law, we are continuing our discussion about executive powers and specifically executive powers when it is related to foreign affairs. But instead of just talking about treaties and foreign affairs in general, we're going to be focusing more on war-making authority that the executive power has and also the legislative has, and the balance that those two branches of government try and work through, despite both branches wanting more of that authority to be reserved to themselves. And we've talked about the legislature and the executive branch having to work hand in hand, and ultimately the court interpreting what is working hand in hand and what is not working hand in hand. So we've got a few things that I want to talk about. We've got Hamdi versus Rumsfeld. We've got Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. And then we have the War Powers Resolution underneath 50 U.S.C. sections 1541 through sections 1548. So let's go ahead and talk about these cases. I won't get into the facts. Ultimately, just our big takeaways that we're going to do when it comes to constitutional executive powers underneath Hamdi. So Hamdi is a situation where he won based off of due process. He was detained. He had a title of enemy combatant, and the executive branch wanted to hold him without giving him any due process rights because of this title. He was categorized as a terrorist and detained because of this situation. And so ultimately what happens, Hamdi, the Supreme Court says that Hamdi gets certain rights. Not entitled to all the rights, but he at least gets some rights. And this includes the right to attorney and against being held indefinitely, because the executive was arguing he can be held indefinitely because we're in an emergency state. This was during the conflict directly after 9/11. We're in an emergency state. We can hold him for as long as we need to until this conflict is gone. And the court says, well, we don't know when the conflict's going to finish, so you need to at least give him some rights until then. So ultimately, our analysis under Hamdi follows this. There's a category of enemy combatants, and that is allowed underneath the Supreme Court's ruling. The federal government does have the power to initially hold, but if they want to continue to hold, specifically American citizens who are called enemy combatants, those American citizens need to be entitled to some form of due process. This means that they have the right of reevaluation of the status of their name of enemy combatant. They have reevaluation of being able to be continually held. They're granted a lawyer. They can produce some evidence to overturn that evaluation. And they are going to do this in front of a neutral decision maker. So this won't be a full-out trial. This won't be a military court, but this is going to be a neutral decision maker, kind of like an arbiter. So even though the defendant has these extra rights, the court does limit this, where the defendant has the burden of proof to show that he is actually not guilty. Some hearsay evidence may be allowed just because this is different, but there is no trial. It's just in front of that neutral decision maker. So that's Hamdi. We have Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, and what had happened in this case is that President Bush had established a statute, again, same conflict, where he set up a military commission, and that commission was to follow certain procedures for trying people who were held in detention by president's orders. And so the executive here, the president, is arguing that the commission is fine and it doesn't violate the Geneva Convention, because the Geneva Convention outlines what international rights need to happen when you're in a war situation. And it's saying that this is fine by both the Geneva Convention, and if it's not fine, they're saying the Geneva Convention doesn't apply. And the court kind of just smacks the executive in the side of the face and says that the Geneva Convention does apply. And that's the big takeaway from this, is that even though the executive tried to come up with a roundabout answer to a procedure of holding people that they thought were terrorists, the Geneva Convention does apply, which gives these people certain rights and protects against certain practices that may be utilized against them. So what should the executive have done? Ultimately, it should have been approved by Congress. But there is an interesting situation where Congress, after Hamden actually came down, they passed a statute that did allow for certain hearings. But the court again denied that the statute fell within proper war-making authority because it actually removed habeas corpus rights. And because the Constitution calls for habeas corpus appeals, the statute would be unconstitutional. So, unfortunately for President Bush, the Supreme Court, in that case was Bermudine, held that statute was unconstitutional. And that was the case even though the president aligned with Congress and would have fallen underneath Jackson's category in Youngstown. There were too many rights that were restricted, and ultimately you can't restrict the rights of American citizens regardless of their status up to a certain point. The final thing that I want to talk about is the War Powers Resolution underneath 50 U.S.C. sections 1541 through 48. And let's talk about some of the powers that are afforded to the president and some that are given to Congress. The president has the power and authority to mobilize wartime efforts. He can send troops overseas. But he needs to do so with a declaration of war. And who has the power to declare war? That's Congress. Congress is the branch of government that says we are getting involved in the conflict. So what happens when Congress does not want to declare war, but the president wants to mobilize troops? Can Congress require the president to mobilize certain troops on their own too, even if the president doesn't want to mobilize troops? And so it's all about trying to find this balance between what can Congress do and what can the presidents do. And the War Powers Resolution was an effort to try and meet that balance. It was passed during the Vietnam War when Congress was trying to get out of the conflict because the Vietnam War was seen as pretty much a disaster at that point because it had gone so long without having a resolution. I think it had gone around 10 years before this resolution was passed, which is kind of funny because we have our conflicts that have gone on decades since 9/11. But ultimately, what the War Powers Resolution says is it limits the president's power to initiate military action. The president is only allowed to enter into hostilities if there is a declaration of war, statutory authorization, or a national emergency that is created by an attack on the country. And if the president does enter into military proceedings, well, then they need to keep Congress informed on those proceedings. And the whole idea between this War Powers Resolution Act was to try and balance who does what, and Congress just wanted to be kept in the loop, and they were tired of being left out of the loop. So if the president engages in military action without approval, then the president underneath this resolution is allowed to commit troops for 60 days and then withdraw those troops, or if there's a good reason for it, he can keep them for another 30 days, unless if Congress says you can keep troops there. So ultimately, it's all about trying to find this balance. But is this resolution constitutional? There is a constitutional objection to it. And that objection is that the Constitution gives the president the right to mobilize military powers. And Congress in this instance is saying that the president can't unless if he has approval from Congress. But on the other side of this argument, Congress is given the power and authority to express war. So is there a constitutional issue? And that's really the large debate about the War Powers Resolution. Ultimately, the resolution has not had much impact on restraining the executive branch from doing much military action. This is seen with President Obama's actions in Libya, obviously the ongoing issues on the war on terror, and other attempts to just mobilize troops. Those aren't the only two examples, but they were the first two examples that popped into my head. But the president has not really been restricted, even though the War Powers Resolution, in essence, was trying to limit that power. And that's what we talked about in constitutional law. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Law Schoolers. Before I let you go, there are 4 things I want to say. The first thing is if you enjoyed these episodes and if you enjoyed the website, I would invite you to go and join Law Schoolers Pro. And you can do that by going to lawschoolers.com/join. It's a way for you to support us, but there's also a lot of features there that I think you will enjoy. Second thing is that nearly all of our episodes are unedited. The only ones that aren't are pre-law materials, and the reason for that is so you can actually see the legal material in its raw form as I'm learning it as well. The third thing is that the information contained in these episodes are specifically only for educational purposes. They're not to be used as legal advice, and with that, the fourth thing is if it is used as legal advice, we are not liable. That is, Law Schoolers is not liable for any legal outcomes. Thank you again for enjoying the show. Have a good one.